Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 30 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. It's my intention for each episode in this series to stand on its own to the extent that that's possible. That means that I hope you can listen to this episode and get something out of it without going back and listening to all 29 previous episodes. With that said, it is still part of a series, and I think it's better with the full context. So if you're the sort of person who, like me, loves to absorb a story in its full context, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time on the History Sphere, I covered the death of Leonid Brezhnev and the brief reigns of his successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, setting the stage for the rise of the star who will now take center stage in this program, Mikhail Gorbachev. This is The End of History, Part 30. It seems like a distant memory now, but there was a time when I was actually really optimistic about American politics. The year was 2007, I had just turned 18, and I just registered to vote. As a young whippersnapper, I was browsing the internet machine for videos on the YouTubes, and I stumbled across some speeches by Texas Congressman Ron Paul, who was seeking the Republican nomination for president in the upcoming 2008 election. Unlike the other candidates in the race from both major parties, he was unequivocally opposed to the US war in Iraq. I was also vehemently opposed to that war, which is what initially caught my attention. But it wasn't just his advocacy for a more humble and nonviolent US foreign policy that drew me to his candidacy. He also spoke passionately about freedom, and he had a very idealistic vision of the American Republic, a sort of back to basics fundamentalism that really spoke to my 18-year-old mind. He looked at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, America's founding documents, and lamented that the government of the United States had fallen far short of the ideals expressed in those documents. And he promised to bring us back to those basic principles of freedom. I was all in. I volunteered for his campaign, I caucused for him, I was even a delegate to my state's nominating convention. We lost that campaign. Ron Paul failed to win the Republican nomination, and he never became president. I was, of course, heartbroken and not a little bit disillusioned at how undemocratic the party nominating process actually was, but that's probably a discussion for another time. My political beliefs have changed and evolved over the years as I gained a more nuanced understanding of the world. The world has also beaten a great deal of my optimism out of me, but my values haven't changed. And while a deeper understanding of US history has caused me to view some of America's founding fathers with slightly less reverence, I still look at the principles of my country's founding documents and think, for the most part, there are some pretty good ideas in there. Things like separation of powers, checks and balances, and the guarantee of certain civil and political rights. I still often look at the way things work now and wish that my country looked more in practice like it does on paper. And that brings me to Mikhail Gorbachev. Some of you may think it's odd that I'm sitting here comparing a communist to a libertarian, and you're not wrong, but Mikhail Gorbachev was also a person who looked at the Constitution and founding ideals of his country and saw a pretty glaring inconsistency between that and the way things worked in practice. And unlike Ron Paul, he actually got the chance to lead his country and attempt to realize his dream. Those of you who have been with me since the beginning, and I love you, may recall that way back in the first episode of this series, I talked about some of the contents of the Constitution of the USSR. I said that on paper, it was probably the freest, most democratic, most egalitarian state in the history of the world. The same broad civil and political rights that we generally enjoy in Western countries, albeit with different interpretations from country to country, were guaranteed in the Soviet Union. Freedom of speech, a free press, freedom of religion, and universal suffrage. In practice, however, the Soviet Union was a one-party authoritarian state. As I've covered in previous episodes, though the worst days of Stalin's terror were long past by the 1980s, people still had no right to criticize the government or the Communist Party. Those who did were often locked up in mental institutions for quote unquote antisocial behavior, or simply jailed on trumped up charges of anti Soviet activities or conspiring with foreign intelligence services. Religion was suppressed, and though elections were regularly held, the Communist Party maintained tight control over the candidates, who were selected by the party and ran unopposed. Soviet citizens, on paper, also enjoyed incredibly broad economic and social rights that are enjoyed to some degree in some Western countries and to a lesser degree in others. Things like universal health care, the right to housing, the right to a job and a guaranteed income, and guaranteed benefits like paid vacation and family leave. This is the area where, by the 1980s, the Soviet Union came closest to actually realizing the promises of its constitution. Public housing in the Soviet Union was often hastily constructed from poor materials, overcrowded, and in short supply, with the majority of families living in relatively cramped, often multi generational apartments. But people generally had a place to live. Soviet healthcare likewise left a lot to be desired in terms of the quality of equipment and availability of medicines, but the doctors and nurses were generally well educated and well trained, and there was no possibility of being financially ruined by medical debt, like still exists in some countries. I'm looking at you, America. And though Soviet workers were often underpaid, they could not be fired for taking time off for vacation, having a baby, or because they were sick. Indeed, because everybody was technically employed by the state, all these benefits were enjoyed equally by all, whether they were a janitor, a teacher, or a nuclear scientist. Of course, in true Orwellian fashion, some were more equal than others, and the elite members of the Communist Party generally had access to better housing, better healthcare, and more luxurious vacations than the general population. The Soviet Union, again on paper, was a democracy where the people elected their representatives to local, republic, and union level Soviets, and those representatives elected the leaders at the same level, with power always flowing up from the people, and leaders at every level always accountable to those below them, with ultimate sovereignty always emanating directly from the people. The Communist Party was intended to be the ideological guiding hand, or as Lenin had put it, the vanguard of the revolution. They would act as a check on the forces of counter-revolution and ensure that this people's socialist democracy did not lose its way as it marched inevitably towards the stateless, classless communist society. The party was also meant to be democratic in its own institutions, with its members directly electing its leaders at the local, republic, and union level. In practice, however, the institutions of the party and state moved from the top down rather than the bottom up. And the state, rather than being ideologically guided by the party, was dominated and firmly subordinate to it, because all of the leaders of the government were members of the party, who owed their positions to the leadership of the party. The power of the general secretary had waned since the death of Stalin in 1953, but if the general secretary was no longer a dictator in all but name by the 1980s, he was still the most powerful and influential man in the party, which was dominated by the members of the Politburo, the highest body of the Communist Party Central Committee. The Politburo, in effect, acted as a sort of collective dictator, with the General Secretary acting as their symbolic leader. When Mikhail Gorbachev was elected to the position of General Secretary in March 1985, few thought he would be remarkably different from his predecessors. Keen observers of Soviet politics all knew that he was essentially Yuri Andropov's protege, and they expected him to be a reformer, but it seems they generally expected those reforms to be of a moderate and conservative nature. Upon his election as General Secretary, the Washington Post noted the nature of Gorbachev's first speech as General Secretary, wherein he promised to continue the policies of his two immediate predecessors, Andropov and Chernenko. In the article, the head of the Washington Post's Moscow bureau wrote, quote, "Diplomatic observers here see Gorbachev as representing a younger generation in the party and the country, a generation alarmed by continuing poor performance of the Soviet economy and urging fundamental changes in the system. Initially, however, he is not expected to make any far-reaching proposals or decisions, as it may take several years for the new leader to build up and strengthen his power base." End quote. Aside from the fact that he was almost 20 years younger than his predecessor Chernenko at the sprightly 54, and thus broke the pattern of the gerontocracy, there was nothing particularly remarkable about Gorbachev. His career up to that point had echoed the careers of dozens, if not hundreds, of other promising party apparatchiks who had obtained a powerful patron and come up through the ranks of the party. He had a real talent over the years for keeping his thoughts mostly to himself and towing the party line in order to rise within the party. One common misconception about Mikhail Gorbachev in the West is that he was some kind of liberal or secret anti communist. He wasn't. He was a dedicated communist through and through. He believed in the ideology of the party to his core, and perhaps even more than his predecessors. The difference was, as I've already talked about a little, he looked at the way the Soviet Union was organized on paper, and he believed that it ought to work that way in reality. And I think every reform he pursued as general secretary had this pure, democratic, egalitarian version of communism in mind. Born to a peasant family of mixed Russian and Ukrainian origin in the village of Privolnya in the Stavropol region of Russia's North Caucasus on March 2, 1931, Mikhail Gorbachev was the first and only leader of the Soviet Union who was actually born in the Soviet Union. All of his predecessors had been born in the Russian Empire before the revolution. Growing up in a peasant community during the years of Stalin's repressions against the peasantry, you can go back and listen to episode 5 if you want a refresher on that history. Gorbachev was no stranger to hardship as a child. He had a somewhat strained relationship with his mother, Maria, who he described in his memoirs as a, quote, tough and strong-minded woman, end quote. And though she loved and cared for her children, Maria was not particularly affectionate. Young Mikhail enjoyed a much more affectionate relationship with his jovial and outgoing father, Sergei, whose extroversion and self-confidence he seems to have inherited. Because his parents were relatively young and poor, they often struggled to provide for his needs. So Mikhail also spent a great deal of his childhood with both sets of grandparents. His paternal grandfather, Andrei Gorbachev, was a hard and uncompromising man. Even in the face of the revolution and Stalin's war on the peasants, Andrei, a veteran of the Russian Imperial Army in the First World War, refused to join or even cooperate with the communists. He was eventually arrested as a kulak for refusing to join a collective farm and failing to meet his production quota for the state, and was later imprisoned in the Gulag. His maternal grandfather, Panteley Gopkala, was the polar opposite of Andrei Gorbachev. An enthusiastic and dedicated communist, he had officially joined the party in 1928 and helped to found the Stavropol region's first collective farm in 1929. Young Mikhail was particularly close with Panteley, and no doubt his maternal grandfather's ideology rubbed off on him. In 1937, Panteley was caught up in Stalin's Great Purge. It is not known who denounced him, but he was arrested by the NKVD secret police for allegedly participating in a Trotskyist conspiracy against the party, for which he was sentenced to death. Fortunately for him, however, he had friends in the local NKVD who intervened on his behalf and managed to reduce the charge to official malfeasance and have him shipped off to the Gulag instead. 14 months later, Panteley was released from the Gulag and returned home. One of Mikhail's earliest memories is overhearing his grandfather recount his experience, explaining that he was tortured by the NKVD agents until he was ready to confess to anything, just to make the pain stop. Mikhail also recounted that his grandfather was never really the same man after that. However, Panteley, like his grandson Mikhail, and like so many Soviet citizens at the time, refused to believe that what he had suffered was the fault of Stalin, instead blaming the tragedy that befell him on rogue NKVD officers. It would not be until many years later that the truth of how highly centralized these repressions were would be revealed in the wake of Khrushchev's secret speech. Mikhail was 10 years old in the summer of 1941 when the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany. Though unlike his predecessors as general secretary, he was too young to fight or take a meaningful role in hostilities, he nonetheless saw the war up close and was forever changed by it. His father, Sergei, was called up to the Red Army and left for the front. With his father gone, Mikhail stepped up to fill his father's role on the farm, forcing him to grow up quickly. The following summer, as the German army advanced across southern Russia towards Stalingrad, Privolnya came under German occupation. Mikhail, along with several of his friends, ran out to watch the first Germans arrive. When his friends ran away at their approach, Mikhail stayed behind, telling his friends he wanted to show them that he was not afraid. The first Germans he encountered were actually very friendly. One, he recalled, patted him on the head and showed him photos of his own children. Another gave him chocolate. He began to think that maybe the Germans weren't all bad. Later, however, a different group of Germans pointed their guns at Mikhail and his friends and forced them to carry water and perform other chores for them. When German soldiers were killed by partisans operating nearby, Mikhail and the rest of the village were forced to watch as members of their community were rounded up at random and publicly hanged in retaliation. After these experiences, Mikhail, like the vast majority of Soviet civilians under occupation, had nothing but hatred for the Germans. That winter, following their disastrous defeat at Stalingrad, see episode 8 if you want to revisit that, the German army retreated from Privolnia, and before they left, they burned much of the village, slaughtered the livestock, and destroyed the seeds for the coming spring crop. Starvation set in. The Gorbachevs survived only because Mikhail's mother took what possessions they had left and set off on a 2-week journey to a neighboring region to trade them for food, leaving Mikhail alone on the edge of starvation. She returned with a sack of corn, which carried them through the winter. In the summer of 1944, Mikhail and his mother received an official notification that his father, Sergei, had been killed in action at the front. It was a letter like millions of others received across the USSR during the war, informing millions of families of the deaths of millions of fathers. Unlike most of these letters, the one the Gorbachevs received turned out to be a mistake. Sergei Gorbachev had been gravely wounded, but he survived. Having been permanently disabled by a piece of shrapnel lodged in his leg, he was allowed to return home to his family toward the end of 1944. As a person who grew up in an affluent society during a time of relative peace and prosperity, the hardships of Mikhail Gorbachev in his childhood seemed completely unimaginable to me. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about them is how unremarkable they were. These same or similar hardships were shared by millions of other children who grew up in that time and place. And what is unimaginable for an American of my generation is just a normal childhood for a Russian of Mikhail Gorbachev's generation. Things that one might expect to break a person's spirit actually enhanced Mikhail Gorbachev's. He emerged from his childhood with a determined optimism that the suffering of his country had to be for something greater. It is perhaps not surprising given this attitude that he eventually gravitated toward a career in party politics. During the hardest years of the war, Privolnia's village school had been closed, and Mikhail had missed out on several crucial years of education. He was not, however, disadvantaged by this, as his entire generation was in the same boat. He returned to school toward the end of 1944, only to find that he at least felt like he was lost and had fallen behind. At first, Mikhail showed little interest in studying, but his family pushed him to get an education. On the instructions of his father, who wrote a letter from the front, Mikhail's mother traded away the last of their possessions to buy him books. Mikhail then borrowed his grandfather's overly large coat to walk more than a mile from his hut to the schoolhouse. After some initial stumbles, Gorbachev actually excelled in school, winning awards for his academic merits. He also joined his school's chapter of the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League. In 1947, he graduated from his village school and went on to study at the regional high school in the regional capital of Stavropol, located nearly 90 miles from his village. Rather than travel the distance daily, which was nearly impossible, as almost nobody had personal vehicles and there were not yet any reliable buses between the city and the villages, Mikhail boarded in the city during the week and returned to Privolnia during the weekends to help his family tend the farm. He excelled at the high school as he had at the village school, and he grew increasingly intellectually curious, gravitating towards the humanities, literature, poetry, and above all philosophy. In particular, he was fond of the works of the early socialist philosophers of the 19th century, as well as the Russian westernizers, the opponents of the so-called Slavophiles who, in the 19th century, argued that the future of Russia's development lay with European ideas and philosophies rather than traditional Russian and religious ones. With his academic success came an increasing self-confidence that Gorbachev's peers found inspiring. He was elected by his classmates as the leader of the local komsomol at the age of 15. One thing that is quite remarkable about Mikhail Gorbachev is his supreme self-confidence, bordering on outright hubris at times. You know that creeping self-doubt that most of us sometimes feel, don't we? It's not just me, is it? You guys feel it too, right? That doubt never seemed to affect Gorbachev. He always just knew that he was supremely capable, and usually right. He just kind of expected his peers to fall in line behind him, and for the most part, they did. He was a natural leader. He wasn't just a natural leader because of his confidence. Confidence alone, without any other good qualities, usually just makes someone completely insufferable. He was also pretty likable, and he had a strong sense of justice. He was often called on by his classmates to resolve disputes and even to referee fights when no agreement could be reached. Gorbachev spent his summer vacations in high school working on the local collective farm alongside his father Sergei. During the 1948 harvest, the father and son duo together harvested more grain with their combine than anyone else in the entire country. For the achievement, the senior Gorbachev was awarded the coveted Order of Lenin. And at the age of 17, Mikhail Gorbachev was awarded one of the USSR's highest civilian honors, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was signed by Stalin himself. When he returned to school that fall, a ceremony was held where all his teachers and classmates lined up to congratulate him. Receiving this honor also turned out to be his golden ticket to an elite higher education. Because he had received such a prestigious award and national recognition, when he applied to study at Moscow State University the following year, he was admitted without having to take the entrance exam. Now, to understand what a huge opportunity this was for a peasant kid from a place like Privolnia, you have to understand a little bit about the institution he was entering. Moscow State University, or MGU, the Russian acronym for its name, was then, and still is today, the most prestigious and elite university in the country. I've heard it referred to as the Harvard of Russia, but I don't think that quite does it justice, because there simply are no equivalent institutions of higher learning anywhere else in the country. It would be more accurate to describe it as Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and MIT all rolled into one. Interestingly, Gorbachev chose to enter the law faculty. To Western ears, there's probably nothing particularly surprising about that. Our governments are filled with lawyers. It's the profession that, for instance, the vast majority of US presidents have practiced. But in the USSR, the legal profession was not generally as prestigious as it is in the West. Gorbachev biographer William Taubman speculates that the reasoning for this is that in a country without the rule of law, lawyers simply don't have as much value. Professions with links to heavy industry, like engineers, were much more well regarded in Soviet society, and it was from their ranks that most of the Soviet leaders emerged. Gorbachev was, in fact, the first Soviet leader since Lenin to have studied law. It was likely his strong sense of justice and his analytical mind that drew him to the field. He began his studies in Moscow in 1950, and in that same year, his application for provisional membership in the Communist Party was granted. When he first arrived in Moscow, Gorbachev was probably blown away by the city. Having been there myself, I was somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of the Russian capital, coming as I did from a relatively small town. But I had at least visited some larger American cities like New York and Seattle, so I had some idea of what to expect in an urban environment. When Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in Moscow, the largest city he had been to was his regional capital of Stavropol, which paled in comparison to the bustling metropolis that was post-war Moscow. It took him some time to get his bearings and to fit in with his fellow students. He arrived in the city with only the clothes on his back, which were neither well-fitted nor the latest style, and his accent gave him away as a peasant. In short, his classmates initially perceived him as something of a country bumpkin. As classes began, however, and his intellect shone through his humble appearance, he was able to win the respect of his classmates at university, just as he had in high school. He was quickly elected to lead the Komsomol for his class at the law school. In 1952, Gorbachev was elevated from provisional to full party member. He was assigned to various duties in the law school by the party, including the monitoring of his fellow students to ensure that they maintained party discipline. His classmates recalled, however, that he had little interest in snitching on them for political dissidents and instead focused his energy on combating vices like drunkenness among the student body. And when the doctors' plot erupted, resulting in a frenzy of anti Semitic persecutions, Gorbachev not only refused to participate, but put himself at risk to stand up for a Jewish classmate who had been denounced. His defense of his classmate was so strident that the NKVD didn't quite know how to handle it. They dropped their accusations and set the young man free. While at university, Gorbachev formed a lifelong friendship with his classmate, the Czech student and future leader of the Prague Spring, Zdeněk Mlynar. The two of them became inseparable, and they would stay up late at night in their dorm room debating the merits of communism and socialist democracy. Both were dedicated communists, but both also ultimately agreed that they would like to see socialist countries become more truly democratic. The other important relationship that Gorbachev forged at university was with Raisa Titarenko, a philosophy student at MGU who was a year younger than Mikhail Gorbachev, but a year ahead of him in her studies. That by 1953, Raisa Titarenko would be Raisa Gorbacheva tells you some of what you need to know about the importance of this relationship, but it actually goes deeper than that. Unlike the wives of previous Soviet leaders, with the possible exception of Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Raisa was destined to be a true partner to her husband. He would always listen carefully to her advice, and she would travel with him to visit various world leaders, often charming them with her unparalleled intellect. Born in the Altai region of Siberia to a Ukrainian father and a mother of mixed Ukrainian, Russian, and indigenous Siberian ancestry, she had spent her childhood largely on the move. Her father was a railroad engineer, and her family moved where the work was. Like her future husband, she was initially looked on as kind of a yokel by her more cosmopolitan classmates when she first arrived in Moscow. But she soon proved herself with her superior intellect and a confident demeanor that Mikhail often described as elegant. She first met Mikhail Gorbachev at a ballroom dance organized by the university to bring together students from different departments in 1951. Mikhail was immediately taken with her, later telling an interview that it was love at first sight. Unfortunately, at the time, Raisa was already engaged to another man. The two became friends anyway, but their relationship remained platonic until Raisa's fiancé broke off the engagement. His parents were well-connected party members, and when they met Raisa and detected her rural accent, they determined that she was not good enough for their son. He obliged them and broke off the engagement. Now, free to follow her heart, she courted and married the future leader of the Soviet Union instead. The pair was married in September 1953. Following the death of Stalin in March 1953, as Nikita Khrushchev rose to power in the Kremlin, MGU became the epicenter of a resurgent intellectual movement in the Soviet Union. With Stalin gone and the new regime relatively tolerant of at least limited political debate, the university seemed to come alive with the spirit of the times. The conversations that Gorbachev and his friend Zdeněk Mlynar had once had quietly in the privacy of their dorm room now came out into the open, as students and professors publicly debated things like the reliability of confessions obtained under torture, while others even dared to float ideas about reforming the legal system, and some even dared to suggest rehabilitating victims of Stalin's purges. Gorbachev seems to have genuinely mourned the passing of Stalin at the time, even making the pilgrimage to his funeral to say his final farewell to the leader. He would later recall that it was as if he and the nation were coming out of a coma, and it would take some time, some years even, for him to fully wake up to the true nature of Stalin's dictatorship. At this point, he still clung to the belief that the excesses of the regime were the fault of rogue officials acting without the knowledge or approval of the great leader. Though he mourned Stalin, Gorbachev also wanted to see changes, and he became an enthusiastic supporter of the reforms of Khrushchev and of the man himself. Upon graduating in 1955, Gorbachev was assigned to work in the procurator's office in the district of Stavropol. A procurator in the USSR was a government lawyer, essentially fulfilling the same function that a prosecutor would in the United States. Indeed, the two words share a common Latin root. His assignment was to enact one of the new policies of Khrushchev and work to exonerate victims of Stalin's repression who had been unjustly convicted. But when he arrived, it became clear that the more senior lawyers in the office did not intend to allow him to do any meaningful work there, believing he was too young and inexperienced, and that the seasoned NKVD agents, whose cases they were trying to undermine, would be able to walk all over him. After only a few days, Gorbachev reached out to his old contacts with the Stavropol Komsomol, who he knew would remember him fondly, and asked if they could find a job for him in the Komsomol. The procurator had little use for him anyway, and the MGU graduate who was known and respected in the region was a good get for the rural Komsomol. And just like that, Gorbachev's career as a lawyer was over almost before it began. He embarked instead on a career in the bureaucracy of the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League. Over the next 6 years, he proved to be a capable administrator, and he rose steadily through the ranks of the Komsomol bureaucracy. By 1961, he was in charge of the Komsomol for the entire Stavropol region. In mid-1960, the Stavropol regional party apparatus received its new first secretary, Fyodor Kulakov. Relatively young at 42 and highly energetic, Kulakov was the quintessential man of the Khrushchev era. He was an enthusiastic reformer and dedicated communist ideologue, and he was well liked by those who worked for him. But he lacked refinement and was seen as crude by many officials stationed above or at equal station with him. Though their personalities were very different, he immediately took a liking to Gorbachev. He saw that Gorbachev possessed the refinement and intellectual bona fides that he lacked, but was also an energetic reformer like him. He took the young Komsomol leader under his wing and started giving him important responsibilities in party business, especially in situations where a more diplomatic tack was required. Though many of the responsibilities were way outside of his job description as head of the Komsomol, Gorbachev took them on with enthusiasm. Whatever else he was, Gorbachev was ambitious, and he understood that this was an opportunity to make himself indispensable to a man that could help him rise in the party. And rise he did. In 1963, when the position opened up, Kulakov had Gorbachev appointed as head of agricultural personnel for the Stavropol Party. In 1964, Kulakov moved on to pursue politics at the national level in the new Brezhnev regime, and was replaced by Leonid Yefremov, who had been demoted from a higher-ranking position at the national level and viewed his posting in Stavropol as a sort of political exile. Gorbachev continuously clashed with him, but nonetheless managed to continue his rise in the party apparatus. In 1966, he was elected first secretary of the Stavropol City Party, and in 1968, he was elected second secretary of the regional party, making him Yefremov's chief deputy. Throughout the Prague Spring of 1968, Gorbachev was privately dismayed at the actions Brezhnev took to shut down the liberalizing reforms in Czechoslovakia, up to and including the full-scale invasion of the country. He was certainly horrified when his best friend from MGU, Zdeněk Mlynar, a key player in the Prague Spring, was denounced and expelled from the party. But Gorbachev expressed none of these views in public. He suppressed his own dissenting views and towed the party line. He spoke often in vague propagandistic slogans, just like all the other Soviet party officials. He accused the Czechs of, quote, ignoring our comradely advice by accepting a reactionary political platform, end quote. This demonstrates one of the qualities that is, while perhaps seen by many as one of his least admirable, also facilitated his rise to power. He was perfectly capable of lying about his true feelings and intentions when it suited his career advancement. It's probably the main reason the world was so surprised when, as General Secretary, he turned out to be such a radical reformer. He had never really said or done anything to let on that that's what he was. To most, he was just another nameless, faceless party bureaucrat. To be fair to Gorbachev, he was just playing the game. He didn't make the rules, but he understood how to manipulate them and turn them to his benefit. A lawyer indeed. And if he had not played the game so well and been so duplicitous, if he, for instance, had just always said what he felt and believed, he probably would have never gotten anywhere near power in the Soviet system. In 1970, he was vetted by Brezhnev himself, who, after meeting him, personally approved his promotion to the post of Stavropol Regional Party boss, a position that, for all intents and purposes, made him the supreme authority in the entire region. Its closest equivalent in the US system would be the governor of a state. The position also came with an automatic seat in the Communist Party Central Committee, and with that came admission to the USSR's Communist Party elite, the group that constituted the ruling class in this supposedly classless society. His primary initiatives in Stavropol concerned agricultural production and development, which makes sense as it was a primarily agricultural region. He did so with some success. At a time when most of the country's agricultural production was becoming increasingly centralized and less productive, Gorbachev decentralized the process, giving heads of collective farms more autonomy to decide what to grow and when and where to grow it. Quotas still came down from the central planners in Moscow, and those quotas had to be met. But rather than micromanage, Gorbachev gave those with knowledge of conditions on the ground authority to decide how best to meet those quotas. While most of Brezhnev's inner circle preferred a more centralized approach, decentralization smacked of course of his predecessor Khrushchev, in truth they didn't much care how the quotas were being met as long as they were being met. And under Gorbachev's leadership, Stavropol was one of the few regions to consistently meet its production goals during the stagnation of the 1970s. Probably more important than his effective governance of the region was the strategic location of it. The Stavropol region was home to the health resorts or sanatoriums in and around Pyatigorsk, and that was a popular vacation destination for many elite leaders of the party and the country. This gave Gorbachev ample opportunity to forge relationships with powerful men during their frequent visits to the region. It was in this way that he first met and befriended the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. Andropov was immediately impressed with the young regional party boss, and also drawn to him on a more personal level. As I said last time, Andropov was a somewhat mysterious person, and few people really knew him well. But he opened up to Mikhail Gorbachev, and perhaps even more so to Raisa Gorbacheva. Raisa Gorbacheva at this time was a teacher, and Andropov was always particularly interested in her insights on the younger generation. Mikhail recalls in his memoirs that the two of them would sometimes sit and talk for hours while he worked. Mikhail, too, would have long conversations with Andropov while their families vacationed together. Sometimes they would just sit around and tell jokes and listen to banned Russian bard music, a genre that Andropov, as the man charged with censoring these artists, was ironically very fond of. Other times the conversation was more serious, and the two of them would acknowledge to each other privately that they agreed the country needed to be reformed, and they would discuss how they wanted to fix it. On one occasion, Gorbachev had the courage to ask Andropov if the inner circle in the Kremlin really had the best interest of the country in mind in perpetuating the Brezhnev-era gerontocracy. Andropov snapped back at him with just a mild hint of humor, quote, "So you've decided to bury us all, have you?" End quote. Gorbachev simply replied, quote, "All I'm saying is that there can be no forest without the undergrowth." End quote. A few years later, when Gorbachev was promoted to Central Committee Secretary in Moscow, largely due to the machinations of Andropov himself, he recalled this conversation to his younger friend, smiling and telling him, quote, "Congratulations, Mr. Undergrowth, you're now part of the forest." End quote. That was in 1978. In August of that year, Andropov ensured that he and Gorbachev vacationed at the same time in Kislovodsk, as they often did. But this time it was different. Andropov knew that Brezhnev and his assistant Konstantin Chernenko would be stopping over there, and he wanted to give them an opportunity to get to know Gorbachev. It was essentially an audition for higher office, one which he passed. He was officially promoted in September when he traveled to Moscow for the Central Committee plenum. As secretary of the Central Committee, Gorbachev was one of the most influential administrative officers in the party. He was responsible for setting the agenda for the Central Committee's meetings, which issues were addressed, who got to speak, and for how long. He effectively used this position not only to advance his own career, but by now, he was forging relationships with other potential reformers who shared similar views, and he used his position to facilitate their rise as well. People like the Georgian party boss, Eduard Shevardnadze, who would eventually become Gorbachev's foreign minister. Gorbachev was elevated to the Politburo as a conditional member without voting rights the following year in 1979, and was granted full voting rights on the Politburo in 1980. His influence increased significantly in November 1982 when Brezhnev died and Andropov succeeded him as general secretary. Shortly after taking office as general secretary, Andropov met with Gorbachev and encouraged him to embrace a broader spectrum of duties in the party, including taking on a more public-facing role. And he was sure thereafter to create opportunities, as many as possible, for his young protege to introduce himself to the Soviet public. For example, he was tasked with addressing the nation on behalf of the Politburo during the annual observance of Lenin's birthday on April 22, 1983. In Politburo meetings, he played the part of Andropov's loyal lieutenant. He was the General Secretary's strongest supporter and closest ally in the Politburo. And to keen observers, it was clear that Andropov was grooming him to be his successor, a development that alarmed the supporters of Konstantin Chernenko. When Yuri Andropov passed away in February 1984, Gorbachev seems to have been genuinely stricken with grief at the loss of his friend and mentor. But while Gorbachev was grieving, Chernenko's allies were scheming to outmaneuver him in the struggle for power. Using pretty traditional methods of political horse trading, Chernenko secured enough votes in the Central Committee to ensure his election as General Secretary. Though Gorbachev had failed in his bid to become General Secretary in 1984, he still had a great deal of support in the party, both from the young guns, who he had helped to elevate himself, and from some of the old guard who had strongly supported Andropov, and continued to trust his judgment that Gorbachev should lead. He was therefore able to secure election as second secretary, the chief deputy of the general secretary, and the person charged with running meetings of the Politburo in the general secretary's absence. Chernenko lasted in the position for just over a year, and for much of that time he was absent from the Politburo, attending to his serious health conditions. He was also suffering from such severe cognitive decline that even when he was able to attend meetings, he still wasn't really there. All this provided an opportunity for Gorbachev to step up and lead in all but name. Gorbachev himself later said that these developments made his election as general secretary on the death of the ailing Chernenko inevitable. And it wasn't just in the Soviet Union that people understood this. Observers of the political developments in the USSR around the world recognized that Gorbachev was likely to succeed Chernenko, and began to take more of an interest in him. None more so than the arch-conservative British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. As second secretary of the party, Gorbachev was also granted the honorific and entirely symbolic title of chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Supreme Soviet. It was under this pretense, however, that Thatcher invited Gorbachev to London in December 1984. With his wife Raisa and a team of advisors, Gorbachev set out for England. The highlights of this trip were an address to the British Parliament, a dinner with members of the cabinet, and a private meeting with the Prime Minister and her husband. Mikhail and Raisa dazzled the Prime Minister and her husband Denis with their humor, intellect, and charm. When the Prime Minister met alone with Mikhail, Raisa was given a tour of the residence by Denis. Margaret Thatcher later remarked of this meeting, quote, "Poor old Denis was longing to get out and practice his golf on the lawn. Instead, he was stuck with this quite opinionated, highly intelligent, slightly didactic lady." End quote. Of Mikhail, Thatcher's interpreter, Tony Bishop, later said, quote, "Gorbachev proved not just equal to, but much bigger than his task. There was about his movements and his utterances an unaffected, self-assured, and unself-conscious air of competence and confidence." End quote. Impressed with Mikhail and Raisa's style and elegance, the British press took to calling the power couple, quote, "the Gucci comrades," end quote. Thatcher herself said of the encounter, quote, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together," end quote. And she soon conveyed this message to her close political ally, US President Ronald Reagan, as well. Just a few months after Gorbachev's meeting with Margaret Thatcher, Konstantin Chernenko passed away on March 9, 1985. The way was now clear for Gorbachev to succeed him. It was clear almost immediately that he had the votes and there would not be any real challenge to his election. The evening before he accepted the nomination, Raisa expressed reservations about the gravity of the position and whether it was really a challenge they wanted to take on. Mikhail concluded that he had no other choice. He told her, quote, "We just can't go on living this way," end quote. They wouldn't. Big changes were on the horizon. Gorbachev intended to completely overhaul the Soviet system and rebuild it from the ground up in the image of the ideals of Lenin. And I will begin to discuss his early years as General Secretary and plans for restructuring the Soviet Union when I return in 2 weeks. That's everything for today. Thank you all so much for listening. As always, I want to give a very special thank you to my patrons and supporters who are supporting the show with monthly donations on Spotify and Patreon. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, links to contribute on Spotify or Patreon can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to all of my streaming platforms and a list of my sources for this week's episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on. That really helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce us to new listeners. It also helps me out if you tell your friends about us. So if you have friends or family that love history, don't forget to send them my way. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will cover the early years of Mikhail Gorbachev's tenure as General Secretary and the start of his momentous program of reform, Perestroika. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.